General Commanding. He's our current adjutant and speaker coordinator. Very pleased to have him on board, and I'm even more pleased that you're going to do a battle presentation on the Battle of Midway. So let's welcome Bill Sayles.
Thank you, Rich. As Rich mentioned, I was planning on scheduling myself for this in 9, 10, or 11 months. So I have quickly put together my slides. An hour ago, I was spell checking them. So hopefully I caught most of the issues on that. So I understand that we've got kind of a range of knowledge probably here about the Battle of Midway. I was initially thinking of introducing the Battle of Midway as the most important naval battle in U.S. history. Then I started thinking about it, and you know, probably the most important naval battle is the Battle of the Capes. The Battle of the Capes is when Admiral de Grasse defeated the British fleet off the Chesapeake Cape and prevented the British from relieving Cornwallis at Yorktown. And if Cornwallis had been able to be extracted from Yorktown and kept that war going, I don't exactly know what the end game is, but by defeating Cornwallis, King George, who wanted to continue fighting, lost all his support in Parliament, and eventually the war came to an end. The asterisk on the Battle of the Cape is it's the most important naval battle in U.S. history. No Americans fought in it. It was the French versus the British. So I'm going to call the Battle of Midway the most important battle that the U.S. Navy has fought, the most important naval battle of the Second World War, and if not the turning point of the Pacific campaign in the Second World War. Churchill called the Battle of El Alamein not the beginning of the end, but maybe the end of the beginning. And I think you have to look at the Battle of Midway in the same sense. Because for 6 months, the Japanese called it the Kutabatai, the strategic carrier group that had struck Pearl Harbor, ran rampant all over not only the Pacific, but Southeast Asia as well. In February, I know Bill Bremer was there recently. They struck Darwin on the north coast of Australia. And by some measures, it was a worse attack than happened at Pearl Harbor. In April, they were attacking Ceylon, what we call now Sri Lanka. They attacked into the Bay of Bengal in India. The British Navy was forced to pull its forces out. The British Indian Navy had to pull their forces all the way back to bases in East Africa. So this major carrier group ran rampant across the Pacific. After the Battle of Midway, June 4th, 1942, the Japanese major carrier group never started another offensive operation. It ended their offensives, changed the momentum. First one are things that we've all heard. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which took place about a month before Midway, as we'll talk about, is very related to Midway. It's been generally described as being a tactical defeat for the U.S. because we lost the Battle of the Lexington. Japanese lost one of their smaller carriers. But it's been described as a strategic victory because the Japanese didn't capture Port Moresby and then weren't in a position to go through and invade Australia. Second thing I want to talk about is the invasion that started one day before Midway of the Aleutian Islands. It's been generally described as a diversionary attack. that was taking place. Another thing I want to talk about is that the general perception, I think if you ask people, was that the U.S. Navy was vastly outnumbered at Midway. Certainly in terms of ships, but even in terms of aircraft forces. Probably, maybe the most famous incident that took place during the battle was the attack by what's known as Torpedo 8, Squadron 8 torpedo bombers flying off the Hornet, attacked the Saryu, and every single plane was shot down. Every single person in the planes was killed, except Ensign Gay, who spent the night at sea and was picked up the next day by a PBY. Finally, it's often reported that the U.S. sank 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. I want to push on that a little bit too when we get there. So as we go on there, let's talk next about why did Midway happen. The impetus for Midway goes back to the Jimmy Doolittle raid. And the Doolittle raid happened on April 15th, where the U.S. flew 15 or 17 B-25 U.S. Army bombers off the Hornet, 600-700 miles off the coast of Japan, overflew Tokyo, overflew the Emperor's Palace, did absolutely minimal damage in the process, but had a huge impact then on how the war was fought. On a personal note, I want to mention that my father-in-law, Larry McCarthy, Patrick's grandfather, was an Army Air Force radio man finishing up training in North Carolina in the spring of 1942. He got orders to hustle his butt across the country and show up at a dock in the Oakland Navy Yard for duty. Hustles across the country, gets to the dock in Oakland, dock is empty. So he starts walking around, what's going on? I said, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but the Hornet sailed 24 hours ago. And he didn't know what that meant until years later. But he eventually, in the 50s, actually met Jimmy Doolittle, had a chance to talk with him. And if he got there 24 hours, he might have been on the Doolittle raid. So, the Doolittle raid, in terms of strategic effort, has minimal importance. But the importance is that it vastly embarrassed the Japanese government, Japanese military, Japanese Navy, that the Emperor's Palace had been overflown by enemy bombers. So what are we going to do about this?
No solution
No
yet,
signal.
Bill.
So, okay.
No.
So what we're going to do about this is a source of tremendous debate within the Japanese government. On the one hand, you have the premier naval force in Japan, Admiral Ishikaru Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. What Yamamoto wants to do is have a climactic battle between the Japanese fleet and the American fleet. His idea is if you invade Midway, you will draw the American fleet into battle and you can destroy them. His bosses, although he didn't seem to necessarily view them as his bosses, was the combined naval staff. But they still wanted to pursue an invasion of Australia. So out of this comes the Battle of the Coral Sea. The combined operations wants to take Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea as a stepping stone to invade northwest Australia. Yamamoto, as a compromise, dispatches Carrier Division 5. The Shikoku and Zuikaku, their two most modern fleet carriers, and a smaller light carrier to go to the Coral Sea as a way for them then to allow him to continue planning for Midway. At the Coral Sea, you have this complex battle. It is the first battle in history where the opposing fleets never see each other. And in the course of that, on the first day, the Japanese lose their light carrier. On the second day, the main carrier groups find each other. The Japanese sink the Lexington, damage the Yorktown. The Americans, on the other hand, attack the Shoikaku, damage it. They shoot up the air group for the Zuikaku. So now what you have then is both the Shoikaku and the Zuikaku are sent back to home waters. The Yorktown, one bomb hit it, was damaged, but it was able to get back 4,000 miles to Pearl. This ends up not being a strategic defeat for Japan in that they can't invade Australia, but because they lose 2.5 tops that could have been at Pearl Harbor, or could have been at Midway. They were never going to invade Australia for several reasons. The Japanese had 38 Army divisions in China, and they weren't enough. So the Japanese Army had no interest in going to Australia. They had estimated it would take 18 divisions to conquer Australia. Second, the Japanese Army had always had more interest going north into Russia than they did going south. And if you remember, 4 months before in December, German panzers could see the Kremlin. The Japanese Army is saying if they could see, in December, if they could see the Kremlin, one more summer, Russia's out of the war and we can go north and invade Russia. Third reason they were never going to invade Australia is they didn't have the sea level capacity. When Yamamoto was looking at attacking Midway, they also looked at attacking Hawaii. They came to the conclusion that Hawaii was a food deficit. 60 ships a month came from the West Coast to supply Hawaii. The Japanese realized that if they took Hawaii, they had no capability of supplying that. So that's why they focused on Midway. So the reason the Coral Sea ends up being a strategic victory for the U.S. is not because Australia doesn't get invited, but you've got Japan's two most modern fleet carriers are now back in Japan. The small carrier is not in operation anymore. We lost one fleet carrier, but net, Japan is now short 1.5 carriers that could have been at Midway. They showed up in Midway with 4 carriers. They show up with 7 carriers. That may have been a different ballgame. Let's talk to the next step in the campaign. The day before Midway, Japan attacks the Aleutian Islands. And again, this is always described as a diversion. But that makes 0 sense. They attacked the Aleutian Islands the day before they attacked Midway. You know, you think about it, all that does is get the Americans, if they didn't have the intelligence that put them in place, all you're doing is alerting them. You know, if you really want it to be a diversion, you attack like a week before so they can get up steam, arm the ships, and go north. But that made sense because strategically, Yamamoto doesn't want the American fleet in Alaska. He wants the American fleet off Midway so he can sink them. Again, makes no sense. What does make sense is that the Japanese didn't know that the B-25s off the Hornet came from aircraft carriers. They were well-known U.S. Army bombers. And the U.S. did not reveal for at least a year where they had come from. In a famous news conference, FDR said they had flown from our base in Shangri-La. And in a wonderful bit of humor, 18 months later, we launched a new aircraft carrier and named it USS Shangri-La. But if you look at the map, it's about 2,000 miles from the final island in the Aleutians, Attu, to Tokyo. Is about 2,000 miles. If you strip out the weaponry on a B-25, put in extra gas tanks, which they did, you can probably fly it 2,500 miles. So there was an element in the Japanese leadership that said the only places these damn planes could have come from were the Aleutians, and we don't want it happening again. So, in fact, they viewed Midway as kind of a reverse diversion. Is while they're busy at Midway, we'll go up and capture a couple islands up there. One of the other things I should mention is, as well as the Japanese having controversy in terms of their leadership, the U.S. had controversy in its leadership. Nimitz and the intelligence staff at Pearl had become very convinced about the radio traffic they were seeing and the other information they were seeing, that the attack was going to be in Midway. Nimitz's boss, Admiral Ernest King, in Washington didn't agree, and his intelligence staff didn't agree with it. King was an incredibly irascible individual. His own daughter described him as being somebody who had two moods, mad and pissed off. Nimitz was not his choice to be at Pearl. It was FDR's choice. King thought Nimitz was a politicized paper pusher, and he rode him very hard in the first year of the war. And when, in the aftermath of the Coral Sea, he had ordered Halsey with the Enterprise and the Hornet to also go to the Southwest Pacific, even though Nimitz wanted them kept in the Hawaiian waters to be ready for an attack at Midway. What Nimitz did was send an eyes-only message to Halsey on the Enterprise and said, "Go let yourself be seen by the Japanese." So Halsey sailed close to a couple Japanese-occupied islands, and sure enough, Japanese patrol planes observed him. Radio intercept picked up the intercepts, and so now there was no longer secrecy. So that gave Nimitz the basis to recall the Enterprise and the Hornet to Pearl. The other thing I should have mentioned about the Aleutian attack is that there were two light carriers that they sent to the Aleutians. So now they're out of commission for Midway. So you think about it, the Japanese potentially could have shown up at Midway with 9 decks and probably close to 300 more planes. but you had this diversion going on. So they violated the first rule of strategic attack, which is concentrating your forces. So let's talk about the forces that did show up at Midway. And I'm going to ignore the Japanese had a vast array of battleships and light vehicles and landing craft and everything, but the Pacific was an aircraft carrier war. So the Japanese ended up showing up with 4 fleet carriers at Midway. They had 6 fleet carriers at Midway at Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, they never once successfully had an attack with all 6 carriers. It shows you how they kind of let their focus get diverted. The Americans showed up with the Enterprise and the Hornet. They rushed the Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor and repaired it and got it back at sea. Part of the reason that the balance ended up being where it was, remember the Zuikaku was undamaged at Coral Sea, but went back to Japan. The Japanese philosophy was that you match the air group to the carriers. So they didn't. They could have taken the remnants of the air groups off the Zuikaku, combined it with their own shot-up air group, and sent the Zuikaku to Midway. But their doctrine was to have them work up specifically with a specific carrier. So they had a fully capable aircraft carrier with enough planes to have shown up in Midway, and it didn't. The American philosophy was entirely different. The Yorktown shows up at Pearl Harbor, their group's been shot up, they've also got the remnants of the Lexington there, but 3 weeks before, the Saratoga had been torpedoed. It had been sent to the West Coast for repairs, but the air groups off the Saratoga were kept at Pearl Harbor. So when the Yorktown showed up, they topped off the Yorktown's capabilities with what was left from the Saratoga. They also made sure that the Enterprise and the Hornet sailed with full deck loads. So let me make sure I get the numbers right here. So let me look at my slide here, Glenn, if at all. Let me do this. So 4 decks for the Japanese, 3 decks for the US. What we also have to think about is you have Midway. Midway is actually 2 islands. And there were operating air bases on both islands. And to his credit, one of the things that Nimitz did was send every freaking plane he could find, be it a Navy plane, Marine plane, Army planes. He had B-17s that he scavenged from the Army to those bases on Midway. You also had a lagoon. He had 31 PDY reconnaissance planes in the lagoon. So, in terms of planes that show up, if you look at, rated capacity, the American carriers show up with about 240 or 50 planes. Japanese carriers could have showed up with maybe 260, but at that point in the war, they were already running short of planes. So they also probably showed up with maybe 230 or 240. So roughly even in terms of numbers of planes off the carriers. But there were 122 different planes based out of Midway of wildly different capabilities. There were some, the Brewster Buffalo that, absolute death trap to fly. But you had B-17s. You had the Catalinas, which made a huge impact on the battle. And we'll talk about later, you had 6 of the new Avenger torpedo planes that were there. And they made, so there's 122. So in terms of planes, and arguably in terms of decks, if you count the 2 air bases at Midway, the U.S. has actually got a slight advantage in terms of numbers. They do not have a qualitative advantage. The Japanese had a qualitative advantage. Their planes were faster, longer range, heavier payloads. Their pilots had been flying combat missions into China as early as 1937. So you had some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. They had torpedoes that worked. What a concept. So, and had repeatedly had successful attacks, including at Pearl Harbor, with torpedoes against combat vessels. They were also capable of coordinated attacks. At Pearl Harbor, they were able to launch the planes off 6 separate flat tops, combine them in the air for a combined mission. On June 4th at Midway, the U.S. was unable to combine their 3 tops to run together. They largely failed even to have the planes off individual carriers attack in a coordinated manner. So they were substantially beyond the U.S. capability in terms of operations in the air. On the decks, the Japanese were able to do a full launch of the planes off the deck in 27 minutes. Took the Enterprise on June 4th over an hour to get their air group into the air. So substantial qualitative differences there. The U.S. advantages were less, but significant in some ways. The PBYs that they had in the lagoon at Pearl were absolutely essential to the battle. PBY is one of the, kind of unacknowledged heroes of the Second World War. There was a PBI flying out of Northern Ireland that found the Bismarck that led to his demise. At Midway, they were able to pick up the Japanese fleet the day before, the landing fleet. They picked up as early as 5:30 on the morning of the 4th. So not only were they picking up earlier at longer range, but they are not an aircraft carrier-based plane. So even though the Japanese knew they had been spotted by 5:30 in the morning, they didn't know the existence of the American carriers until 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning. So the PBIs provided a huge advantage to the U.S. The Japanese, by contrast, were sufficiently short of planes that they did not use carrier-based scouts. The scouts they used were float planes off their cruisers. They had 17 of them, and they did kind of an ineffective job. You think about the 5 potential other tops that could have been there, they could have been doing scouting for the Japanese that morning. Another advantage the U.S. had and used effectively was all the U.S. planes and the ships were in radio contact. The Japanese at that point in the war did not routinely have radios in the cockpits of their planes. So their combat air patrols that were flying over their 4 carriers off Midway did not have effective radio communication with planes in the air. They also did not have any capability to coordinate combat air patrols among each other. So that, and at that point they had some radar capability, but it wasn't very effective. On the other hand, both attacks the Japanese made on the Yorktown were picked up at considerable range by the Yorktown's radar, which had a huge impact. Final advantage I would touch on is the U.S. had a different philosophy in damage control on the ships. The Japanese had relied on dedicated damage control parties if there was an attack on the ship. The difficulty of that is, and it showed up during the battle, is, you know, the damage control party is headquarters at one end of the ship, and the bomb hits between it, you've got people all cut off. And they did not respond effectively to damage situations. U.S. Navy philosophy was everybody on the ship is a damage control fighter. So there are instances of people, airmen, unrelated to fighting the ship, but they saw a pump, a hose that had to be manned, and they grabbed it and they operated with it. So very, very significant philosophy change there. So let's talk about then the actual attack on the morning of June 4th. The attack starts out with the Japanese launching a mission to attack the defensive installations on the islands. Took off probably at about 5 in the morning with half the planes on their carriers. Yamamoto had ordered that they would keep half their planes back, armed with torpedoes in case they found the American carriers. So it goes off, they do the bombing mission, reasonably successful, but doesn't knock everything out. So flying back, the commander of the mission radios back to the carriers, we're going to have to do another bombing mission. Meanwhile, since the Americans had picked carriers up at 5:30 in the morning, Midway is starting to launch planes absolutely helter-skelter at the fleet. But it has the advantage in that it keeps them busy all morning. And you've got these uncoordinated combat air patrols that are fighting and landing and doing everything. As near as I can figure out, the planes that flew out of Midway that morning never hit a single thing. But it kept them busy. Because by 8:30 or 9 o'clock, they identified that northwest of them was at least one U.S. carrier. And they wanted to attack it. But they couldn't get their carriers into the wind to launch because of the planes coming in from Midway. Meanwhile, their own planes are now returning from Midway. So you've got this question, do we launch against the American carrier and let our planes go into drink? Or do we recover them and then launch after? So they make the decision to recover their aircraft. The first the Americans had, when they first got the report at 5:30, the American carriers were northwest of the Japanese and were out of range. So they spent several hours moving southwest to get within launch range. So eventually they launched at about 8 o'clock at extreme range. And now I'm going to talk specifically about Torpedo 8. Torpedo 8, VT8, flies off the Hornet 15 planes in Douglas Devastators. Incredibly slow planes. Attack speed is 100 knots. I'm taking flying lessons in Cessna 172. It could beat that. But they take off. The Hornet is able to get their air groups in the air in a coordinated manner. So you've got Wildcat fighters and dive bombers above, the torpedo planes below. Mark Mitcher, the captain of the Hornet, comes to the conclusion that the Japanese will continue to move towards Midway and it orders his planes to move in that direction. Turned out he was dead wrong. After about a hour in flight, the commander, John Waldron, of the torpedo group comes to the conclusion that they're going in the wrong direction. So against the orders of the air boss, who's above him flying in the Douglas Devastator, he takes off on his own initiative to take the torpedo planes to where he thinks the Japanese are. Turns out he's right. So the first carrier-based attack that goes in is Torpedo 8 against the Sayles. And the Combat Air Patrol from the Sayles shoots down all 15 planes. Two people in each plane. The only survivor is Ensign Gay from Texas, who spends the day hiding underneath his raft because the Japanese were strafing people in the water. And then at night, he finally climbs into the raft, and the next day, guess what? Another PBY picks him up. So it is well known. How many people know that Ensign Gay was the only survivor of Torpedo 8? Only that's not really what happened. When the Hornet was on the East Coast in April, they launched 2 B-25s off the Hornet to test that this could be done, and then it sailed to the West Coast. At the same time, they got notice from Grumman that they were getting delivery of the first Avenger torpedo planes. Vastly better plane, much longer range, attack speed 200 knots rather than 100 knots. So they took the 16 least experienced pilots out of Torpedo 8 and left them in Virginia to work up and train on the Avengers. As the Hornet then goes to the East Coast, then goes and attacks Tokyo and comes back, these people are working up on the Avengers, eventually fly to the West Coast to San Francisco, break their planes down, load them on a ship, and take them to Hawaii. Their ship lands a day after the Hornet heads out to Midway. They dig the planes out of the ships, they're frantically putting them back together. They get 6 of them put together in time for them to then fly at their extreme range, 1,200 miles, from Pearl to Midway. They assign 2 PBYs to be the scout planes for them to kind of lead the ducks to Midway. They get to Midway a day before. Now, mind you, these pilots are so inexperienced, both the ones on the Hornet and the ones in the Avengers, that many of them have never flown a torpedo plane with an actual torpedo in the plane. And most of them had never actually dropped a torpedo ever. So you've got these vastly experienced Japanese pilots and crews. You've got these incredibly inexperienced Americans doing the attack. So the actual first planes to attack the Japanese at Midway were not Torpedo 8 off the Hornet, but were the 6 Avengers flying out of Midway. Now they're a much better plane, 3-person crew rather than 2-person crew, but their results weren't any better. 5 of the 6 get shot down. The 6th one is attacked from the back. The crewman, gunner, radio man up above is killed. The plane, at the end of all this, they count 70 holes on the plane. The rudder controls are destroyed. So the the elevator controls. The elevators are the flaps on the back of the plane that determine whether you go up or down. So the pilot is there pulling on the stick, nothing's happening. And most planes, for safety reasons, are designed nose down, so this is going down. So the young pilot is thinking, better get ready to ditch. But he does something that's instinctive, is his nose is down. So there's a control tab, and the control trim tab. So there's a little wheel that you use the trim tab, and it's a small flap on the back. But as a pilot, you don't want to be flying around constantly having the nose up. You do the trim tab to get things neutral, so you can take your hands off and do other things. He goes down, he flicks the trim tab, nose comes up. So with his elevator shot out, only with the trim tab, he is able, and he's been wounded, his compass is shot out, so he gets himself back to Midway basically by saying, that guy looks like he knows what he's doing, we'll follow him. And it takes him 3 passes to land on Midway, and the plane's a write-off. But he and the bottom gunner survive. So the real story is there are 3 survivors of Torpedo 8 at Midway. The last thing I want to talk about is what's usually described as the American sank 4 Japanese carriers. Point of fact is the American sank no Japanese carriers. What they did do was turn them into burning hulks of twisted metal. And it comes down to differences in terms of carrier design. Japanese carrier design had armored flight decks and enclosed, steel enclosed hangars below the flight decks. And the example I'll use, because it's most dramatic, is the Akagi. Had actually 2 hangars stacked on top of each other. The Akagi was hit by one 1,000-pound bomb, penetrated the deck, blew up in the hangar. 3 hours later, they abandoned the ship. The story is that when the dive bombers from the Enterprise under McCluskey show up, they line up to attack Akagi. At the end, there's a 3-plane flight with Commander Best. He's tail end Charlie. He's able to observe that they've got 4 hits on the Akagi. Comes to the conclusion it's toast, literally. Looks over and realizes nobody has been attacking the sister ship, the Akagi. He takes his two other wingmen, and they dive on the Akagi. They hit each on the side, don't hit the ship, hit on the water, near on board, minor damage. He hits in the middle of the flight deck. And once they penetrated the flight deck into the hangar, what you've got in this enclosed hangar is now the Japanese planes that have returned from Midway who are being refueled. You have the half the planes that we're going to attack and were loaded with torpedoes and are being now rearmed with bombs. And they didn't strike the torpedoes back down in the magazines. So you've got this incredible mixture in this confined space of fuel oil, of aviation gasoline, torpedoes, bombs, and it just blew up. Incredibly blew up. I talked about the damage control differences. Another difference goes back to that that Japan is a resource poor country. So if you tour an American aircraft carrier, I know John has gone on the Midway, which is now in San Diego Harbor, everything on the ship is steel. Japanese aircraft carriers were short of steel. So they had wooden desks, wooden tables, wooden chairs. They minimized how much steel they had to use on the ship. So among all the other flammable things that were there, You had those things going on. So it went up. The flip side is what happened with the Yorktown. Yorktown took one bomb hit at Coral Sea, was able to steam 2,000 miles or 4,000 miles later to Pearl, went to the dock, and they had a dry dock for 3 days, showed up ready for combat at Midway. It was the subject of the first Japanese attack. It took 3 bomb hits then. They were able to control the fires. For example, they had a portable 800-gallon gas tank on deck for refueling. They just pushed it off the side of the ship. And the U.S. carriers did not have an armored flight deck. They had a 3-inch wooden flight deck. And underneath them was the hangar deck, which was largely open to the outside. So you did not have confined spaces for fuel fumes and things like it in there. They literally were taking burning planes and pushing them off the side of the ship. So they take 3 bomb hits. They were able, and 2 hours and 20 minutes later, they were back steaming and doing flight operations. When the second Japanese attack appeared, the second Japanese attack was largely fought off, but 2 Japanese torpedo planes came in, hit the Yorktown. It developed a significant list, evacuated the crew, but it didn't go down. So the next day, they put a salvage party back on. They were able to get the fires under control and actually get it back under tow to take it back to Pearl. And then a Japanese submarine found it and put 2 more torpedoes in it and sank it. But to me, what is really significant is how the different design philosophies of the 2 navies had an impact. Talked about the damage control philosophy. Another difference I would argue that shows up is the United States at that time was a mechanical society. People grew up at farms, they grew up tinkering with the Model T and the Model A in the driveway. So if there was a pump that wasn't working, they felt confident they could go and fix it. The Japanese were a non-mechanical society. Didn't deal well with unscheduled problems like that. And they were a very hierarchical society. So very disciplined to follow orders and only follow orders. On the other hand, when the Lexington sank in the Coral Sea, the Lexington sank because it still had gasoline in its fuel lines when they were hit. And that spread fires that eventually sank the Lexington. Between Coral Sea and Midway, the Lexington had figured out, led by a chief petty officer, the naval equivalent of a master sergeant. Always follow the sergeants. He figured out that you could drain the fuel lines, pump them full of CO2, and then they wouldn't be a lethal weapon used against you. The radar gave them enough warning of the both incoming attacks to do that process. So that's a reflection, I think, not only of the different and mechanical capabilities of society, but the hierarchical nature of the society, that in a 3-4 week period, this innovation could be spread that quickly and put into effect. Okay. So let's go back to those things we started talking about. We talked about how I think Carl C was a strategic mistake, not because they didn't invade Australia, but potentially they could have shown up with 2.5 more decks and probably close to 175 more planes. The Aleutians wasn't a diversion, but it ended up costing strategically because they had 2 small carriers that went to the Aleutians. So really, they could have potentially showed up at Midway with 9 decks with full complements of planes. Tremendously different problem for the Americans at that point. We talked about how there were 3 survivors of Torpedo 8. And the last one was the U.S. didn't sink any Japanese carriers. They turned them into burning hulks of scrap metal. But since they hit them with dive bombers that started these secondary fires and explosions, it didn't damage the integrity of the hulls. So all the Japanese carriers were sunk by Japanese destroyers putting torpedoes into them. And I think essentially for a vanity reason, wasn't that the Americans were going to tow them in and, repair them or anything like that. I think Yamamoto did not want a picture of the Japanese carrier with an American flag flying on top of it. So, essentially a waste of torpedoes to make sure that you didn't have a publicity op on. So, those are some of the, what I view as kind of interesting sidelights to the Midway battle and campaign. So with that, questions?
Studying the Midway because your dad, your grandfather, or
Father-in-law?
okay.
A little bit of a touch, but I've been interested in, there's a book called Shattered the Sword that came out 5 or 10 years ago, and it told the battle from the point of view of the Japanese. And everything we've seen has been 99% American-centric, and much of it Hollywood-centric, and this was opening up another window. So I found that interesting and then started digging around for some more facts and background on it. So.
Was there a tactical decision that the Americans made that you thought was most important? And you talked about several of them. Is there one that really stands out as being critical to the success that the Americans experienced?
Yeah, I think Steve asked, was there a tactical decision? I think it goes back to the fact that having, I wouldn't say broke the code, but they were reading the code. They had a good idea of the Japanese layout of the forces. And by putting the American carriers to the northeast, they were within striking distance then of the Japanese carriers, but they were kind of not easily found by the Japanese when the Japanese were doing scouting. So putting them at that specific location, I think, turned out spectacular. And that was largely Nimitz and Spruance made that decision. There were other technical decisions that were horrific. Mitcher on the Hornet, as near as I can figure out, the Hornet never dropped a bomb the whole day. As the first attack went off, a number of the fighters just ran out of fuel. Some of them had to bail to Midway and then fly back to the carrier. Many of them landed back on the Hornet without dropping their bombs. And then later in the day, when they went after the last remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, that was mainly Enterprise and Yorktown planes that had moved to the Enterprise did that because Mitcher screwed up the deck management and was recovering planes when he should have been launching planes. Nimitz put him on the beach for 7 months. He then came back and ended up being the commander of the fast attack carriers under both Halsey and Spruance later in the war, and had a spectacularly successful career doing it. But he rightly so took a lot of grief for how he managed the Hornet that day. Rich?
Was there, I mean, this could be both Japanese and Americans, but when they take off from the carriers, I mean, there has to be like an attack plan, I would think. Can you kind of describe that? First of all, it seems like they maybe knew a general direction to go. That would be the first, like, finding them. But when they actually did the attack, did they use like certain formations and like fighters for flankers and stuff like that to protect the torpedoers? And
The general plan, and it worked so-so, was that your torpedo planes would go in low, at low altitude, hopefully bring down the enemy fighters on you, and then the dive bombers, protected by the fighters, would dive on the enemy ships. In terms of direction, it doesn't appear that there was a centralized direction that either Spruance, or when he showed up, Fletcher became tactical commander, did not specifically say, you will fly this route. It was left to each carrier to determine what vector they would go on. And remember, these are very fast ships. They're doing 30 knots, 35 miles an hour, and it's going to take you 2.5 hours to get there. So they can conceivably be 140 miles in either direction. So that's why it wasn't surprising really that the Hornet never found them. But there was kind of a plan, but we were very early in the Americans developing tactical capabilities. It wasn't until a year later that you started seeing the U.S. carrier groups do multi-ship unified missions. Up until that point, it was whatever came off every carrier did its own thing. John?
So Bill mentioned CO2 into the gas lines and a blow that left the carriers less vulnerable. And this is kind of a funny aside, but we had a shark in a machine one night on a farm, and Pat, Bill Son, was living out of our place. And this machine ignites, and it goes up. And it's just a little machine, it's a little skid steer loaded. It looked like a Roman candle, didn't it, Pat? I mean, it was incredible. And so those kinds of decisions are incredibly important. I mean, that thing burned down. I mean, there was nothing but steel when the fire was over. And the same thing in that aircraft carrier, that all that fuel, all those explosives.
Yep.
I'd like to mention 2 books. One is The Code Breakers, and it's the women in Washington, D.C. who, in quotes, broke the Japanese code. And the story about them is about Walter Isaacson. Is fascinating. The sexism. The woman who everybody agrees is the best code breaker by far. And they put her husband, who was not bad, in charge, and he gets double her salary. The other thing is, when they hired people, they hired primarily women who were nurses, or elementary school teachers, or librarians, because they found that code breaking is very, very tedious. And these women were all the type who could concentrate for long periods of time. And the Navy officers who were assigned with those code breakers were virtually worthless because they spent all their time trying to get out of there, because you don't get promoted in the Navy if you're working in this code. But they were able to send enough of the code information to Hawaii that eventually they could work out that Midway was going to be the target.
Yeah, the intelligence and code work that was behind it is a fascinating part of the story. And also part of Ernest King's retribution, because the guy at Pearl, who led the code breakers, was Commander Rochefort, one of the absolute heroes of the Second World War, but he didn't agree with King or the Washington Intelligence Group, so they eventually promoted him to running a dry dock in Washington. So, no good deed goes unpunished.
The other book I have has nothing to do with what you're talking about, but I thought many of you would be really interested. I found it fascinating. The title of the book is The Mosquito Bowl, and it's a football game on Guadalcanal. There are 2 Marine divisions there. Both of them are loaded with top-flight athletes. Dave Schreiner, who's first All-American at Wisconsin, is one of them. And these 2 outfits were at each other's all the time, giving them a hard time. So they arranged, they were training to go and invade Okinawa. They decided to play a football game, which they did on Christmas Eve, or Christmas Day, just before they left. And he gives the stories of all these people who were involved. And as I mentioned to Chuck just before this, the game, because there was a lot of coral in the area they cleaned out for a football field, was to be a touch game. And that lasted about 3 minutes. But he traces them all. He gives you the background of these guys who were football players at Illinois and Wisconsin and Pittsburgh and so on. And in the end, these guys all go to Okinawa, where we had more top athletes killed in that battle than any other battle that we've ever been in. It's a humorous, sad, interesting story.
Any last questions, comments? Thanks again.
Thank you.